organization on their campus. They called it the Apathy Club. Their Apathy Club was not like any other student group. While most organizations have some kind of purpose or goal, they had no goal. Their goal was advertised as pursuing nothing, believing in nothing. They simply didn't care about anything, and they were going to demonstrate this in their group. One big problem arose, though. The self-appointed officers advertised the first meeting, and not a single person showed up, because anybody who might have been interested didn't care enough to attend. You think that's kind of humorous, it's a little bit funny, until you realize the apathy epidemic that's raging in American Christianity today. The dictionary says that apathy is a lack of feeling or emotion. It's defined as passivity or indifference, or an absence of concern or interest. Apathy has a close cousin, and that cousin is complacency. And complacency brings the added component of self-satisfaction. Christians in America have become complacent. Complacent while a war is raging against us. Paul makes it very clear in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 6, how he fights this war. And Christians today cannot afford to be apathetic about these battles. You must fight the spiritual warfare. We're going to be reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 6. But just to give you an overview of what's going on in this chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is basically Paul defending his ministries against the claims that the Corinthians had placed against him. They accused him of walking immorally, walking worldly, walking in the flesh. And they also accused him of being a coward. And this whole chapter is dedicated to Paul defending his ministry, saying how he fights the spiritual warfare and how he walks against the flesh for God. We read in verse 1, it says, "Now I, Paul, myself beseech you, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold towards you." That's where it is. Being present, I am base among you. Being absent, I am bold towards you. He's saying, when I'm there, I am base among you. But when I'm gone, I am bold towards you. "But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh." And he says, I hope I don't have to be bold when I'm there with you. I don't want to be bold when I'm there with you. I want to be kind, and I want to love you guys. But there is sin in this congregation, and we have to take care of this. We have to fix this wrong. And he doesn't want to be bold when he's there, but he will if he has to. We read on in verse 3, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh." And that's Paul saying, though I'm a fleshly person, though I am physical, though I am made out of the same substance that you are, I do not walk after the same lusts of the flesh as some people do. In verse 4, and this is where he really picks up, and he stops talking about them and their claims against him, but he starts talking about himself and saying how he fights the spiritual warfare. He says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled." Paul outlines here 3 main points about how he fights the spiritual warfare. In verse 5, the first point is casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of God. The second point is bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. And finally, having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. The first point is casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalted itself against God. Casting down imaginations, captivating your thoughts. Cast down, destroy, demolish these evil things that present themselves against God. You must destroy, firstly, imaginations. Destroy false reasonings in your own mind. Any thought that you have that's against God, cast it down, destroy it. Don't let it fester. Don't let it grow, because it will destroy you. Rather, you must destroy it. Then you must also stand against any ungodly thought that is presented to you. If somebody comes to you and they're teaching ungodly things, don't let it go. Don't act like you believe what they believe. Cast it down, destroy it, and demolish it. Don't let it live. When we're doing this, we can choose to either walk one of 2 ways. We can do it our way, or we can do it God's way. If we choose to do it God's way, we'll be like Daniel, When Nebuchadnezzar erected this huge statue, this huge monument of himself, and he told the princes of Israel to bow down to it. And Daniel stood up and said, "No, because I serve the living, the true God." And he stood up against evil. And he stood for what was right. We can choose to do it God's way, or we can choose to do it our way. Like the people at the Tower of Babel did it. They didn't want to get to heaven God's way. They wanted to get there their way. And so they built this giant building to where they would be able to reach heaven on their own. But you know what God did? God cast down that building. God destroyed it. And he separated these men. He cast down the imaginations. He cast down the high things that were set up against him. And we should cast them down as well. There are many evil things in our society that seem impossible to cast down. But that doesn't change the fact that we must stand against them by the power of God. We must fight the spiritual warfare. The second point Paul writes in this verse, in verse 5, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. The second point is you must control or lead away captivate evil thoughts. How do you do this? Well, first you need to fortify your heart against ungodly thoughts. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." Keep your heart. Captivate your heart. Keep your mind. David was a man, a great man, a man after God's own heart. But David was also a man who failed to captivate his thoughts. David was out on top of his castle one day, and he's looking out among the city. And he sees a woman bathing. And instead of looking away and walking away like he should have, he decided to look. He chose to look. And he didn't captivate his mind, he looked. And he ended up almost murdering. No, he did murder somebody because he failed to captivate his thoughts. On the other hand, we have a man like Joseph. When Potiphar's wife was constantly trying to seduce him, Joseph fled every single time after time. And he captivated his thoughts. He kept his heart. He guarded his mind. And he was rewarded for it. God rewarded him for it. We need to fortify our heart against ungodly thoughts. But not only do we need to fortify our hearts against ungodly thoughts, not only do we need to keep those thoughts out, we have to put good thoughts in. Which means that we need to fill our head with godly thoughts. How do you do this? Read your Bible consistently. Attend church and form a strong relationship with your pastor and those in your congregation. Pray earnestly to God. Isaiah 26:3, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee." Keep your mind on God. Captivate your thoughts. Today's society bombards our minds with tons and tons and tons of ungodly information. But our minds must be captive to Christ. We must fight the spiritual warfare. Finally, Paul ends this section, with verse 6. And he says, "And having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience, when your obedience is fulfilled." You must correct or vindicate evil theologies. You have to be willing to stand up and correct those around you. Having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Revenge the disobedience. If someone is doing something wrong, don't let it stand. This is much like the first point. Don't just let it stand. Cast it down. Revenge the disobedience. We need to be ready to stand up for what's right. Stand up for righteousness. Know God's word and be able to proclaim it to the unknowing. Correct your Christian siblings in the love of Christ. Galatians 6:1 says, "If any of you be overtaken in a matter or in sin, restore such an one unto righteousness in all humility." Correct your siblings with the love of Christ. Revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Don't only stand up for righteousness, but also stand against unrighteousness. Make it clear that you will not put up with something that's wrong. If a situation arises where you have information that someone is doing something wrong, it's not right for you to just let that go. You have to make it clear that you stand against unrighteousness. Cast it out. Cast it down. And revenge it. Do what is right because God says it's right. I oftentimes think of Elijah the prophet when I come to this point. And Elijah was on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. And he challenged them. He said, "Let's build our altars. And the true God, we will pray to our gods, and the true God will cast down fire and brimstone and will burn up and consume these altars. The ironic part is that Baal was the prophet, Baal was the god of fire. And so they do it. They set up their altars, and Elijah had his altar over here. And the prophets of Baal set up theirs over there. And Elijah said, go first. Let's see what you got. And the prophets of Baal are cutting themselves, dancing, crying out before Baal. From 6 in the morning till 12 in the afternoon. And you know what? Baal did not answer. And they kept dancing and they kept dancing. And Elijah's sitting at his altar and he's mocking them, saying, where is your God? Where is your God? Finally, Elijah decides to stand up and he says, enough. And he digs a moat around his altar, fills it with water. He douses the rest of his altar with many, many barrels of water. And the prophets must have been thinking, what is he doing? He's trying to get fire, not flood this thing. How is this going to work? And Elijah just says, stand back and watch. And Elijah prays to his God, and he says, God, send down fire and brimstone from heaven. And lo and behold, God sent down fire and brimstone from heaven. And consumed everything, even things that were not flammable. Even things that don't burn, rocks. He consumed the water. He consumed everything. Because Elijah stood up for what was right. Be ready to stand against unrighteousness. We seem to be afraid to take a stand for Christ. We don't want to do the right thing because it's hard. But we have to make a stand. We must fight the spiritual warfare. We have to stand for Christ. On December 7, 1941, the infamous day of Pearl Harbor, 353 Japanese airplanes were swarming all around the harbor. Within a couple of hours, America lost 8 big battleships, 6 major airfields, almost all planes, and 2,400 men. That happened at 7:50 in the morning, in what was supposedly a surprise attack. But here are the startling facts. That morning at 7 a.m., while the Japanese warplanes were 137 miles, or 50 minutes away, 2 U.S. soldiers on a small radar station in the Pacific scanned the screen. And they saw dots and dots and dots appearing on the screen until the whole screen was filled. These soldiers notified their youthful supervisor, a young lieutenant. No other officer was around, and he was the only one there to make the decision because it was Sunday. The lieutenant thought that these must be planes from California, and without another thought said these crucial words, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. There would have been time to scramble the planes of Pearl Harbor, prepare the battleships, and shelter the men. But this lieutenant, in the most responsible moment of his career, failed the nation. Every day, we sit at the radar watching the scanners in our lives. Dots and dots appear on this radar one by the multitude, and we see them all. But a lot of times we don't even think to act. Other times we're scared, but regardless we fail to take the action. This is not acceptable in God's war. We must respond. We must take action. We must fight the spiritual warfare.